So today we're going to talk about squat shoes. Squat shoes are, I think, a great topic because a lot of people wear them for no particular good reason other than the fact that they see other people in the gym who are really strong wearing them. And they're like, oh, that much must just be what you do when you want to squat heavy. Not the case. And today we're going to talk about why it's not the case. All right, so squat shoes are going to do a couple different things for you. Most people, when they think about squat shoes, are really only thinking about the fact that they add dorsiflexion. So dorsiflexion is more or less ankle mobility, ankle flexibility. You can think of it that way. It's not exactly the same, but it's close enough for our purposes. So if you're somebody who has really tight ankles, you'll probably find that when you try and squat, trying to go into a deep squat, you lean forward onto the balls of your feet, right? Your ankles might come off the ground. You might have some tightness in your calf or maybe even your hamstring or quad. And somebody might have told you, hey, you have tight ankles and that's why you're having trouble. Or maybe you can't hit depth at all because you have pain or something in your ankles. That is a problem. That is definitely a problem. You do need a certain amount of dorsiflexion to be able to hit depth. But the thing is, most people have sufficient dorsiflexion to hit depth if they get themselves in the right position to squat. Beyond that, if you don't have sufficient dorsiflexion, it's pretty easy to build. And for that reason, I don't think that you should get squat shoes just based on the fact that you have tight ankles. I think that you need to look at the other factors that are involved in squatting, in squat mechanics, and in wearing heeled shoes before you make that decision. So those are what we're going to look at today. I've already kind of touched on dorsiflexion. The fact that you're raising your heel off the floor means that in order to get the same amount of forward knee displacement, your ankle doesn't have to move as far. And you can kind of see that in this diagram, right? So right here, this is a heeled shoe and this is a flat shoe. And you can see with the heeled shoe, right, with this elevation here, this artificial elevation of the lower limbs, you're getting with the same angle between your foot and your shin, right? That's the same angle. You're getting more forward knee displacement in this one than you are in this one, okay? So that's essentially the benefit of having that heel. Now, there's a couple other things that this heel is going to do that people don't really think about. The first one is balance. This one should be really, really easy to see, all right? If you walk around on high heels, you're going to be leaning forward a little bit more. That's all there is to it. If you're a girl, you probably already know this, right? You probably worn high heel shoes before and probably have trouble balancing at first, right? I think that's a pretty common thing you'll see on TV or whatever. So the other thing that you have to keep in mind when you're wearing heels is that they're essentially acting as a counterbalance for wherever the weight is in your body. So if you're doing a back squat, your center of gravity, your natural center of gravity has shifted back because all of a sudden you have a ton of weight on the back of your shoulders. And so normally you would have to lean forward a little bit to counteract that. Well, with heeled shoes, you're already going to be leaning a little bit forward, so you're going to be leaning more forward. All of a sudden your center of gravity is shifted, and so your body is going to have to compensate for that. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. Contrast that to if you're doing a front squat or even a safety bar squat to some degree where the weight is on the front of your shoulders and you're going to have to lean back a little bit in order to balance that. Well, with the heels, you're going to be more centered because the heels are going to push you a little bit forward and the weight is going to push you a little bit back. All right? So that's one thing to consider about balance. The other thing to consider about balance is that usually if you get a good pair of squat shoes, and this isn't true for all squat shoes, but for most squat shoes, they're going to have a nice thick heel that's made out of one solid piece of material. Again, not always the case, but usually the case. And if you contrast that to most flat shoes, even shoes like kind of Chuck Taylors or maybe wrestling shoes, generally you're not going to get as stable a platform with those flat shoes as you are with specialized squat shoes. That's a benefit, okay? When you're walking out with a heavy weight, having that very firm, very solid material that's not going to move, it's not going to twist on you at all, that's really, really good. The reason I say that you're not getting quite the same benefit out of a pair of, say, Chuck Taylors, you still have a tiny, tiny bit of material that's usually it's something softer, something that's going to have a little bit of give. For the vast majority of people, probably not going to notice the difference, But if you're a pretty strong squatter and you're squatting pretty heavy weight, you might. And so that's something to keep in mind. Okay? These two things, I think, to a certain degree, you can compensate for them with practice rather than having to get a new pair of shoes, okay? So if you have trouble balancing, you can work on that, right? You can do heavy walkouts. You can hold the weight after you finish squatting. You can just, make sure that every set you're doing, you're really focused on balance. You're really being mindful of your kinesthetic awareness, where your body is in space before you begin squatting. That can all help with balance. Dorsiflexion, very simple. You can do ankle mobility drills. You can go watch the Unfuck Your Squat video and see some of the things that you can do for your lower body to kind of improve your mobility in that position. Leverage, I think, is the real big one that we want to think about when we're considering whether or not to wear squat shoes. Okay? So let's go back to our diagrams. Flat shoes, heeled shoes. When we're looking at flat shoes, all right, this is our angle. This is the amount of dorsiflexion we have. This could be any angle, but we're going to say it's this. All right? Remember, whenever you're squatting, no matter what, the weight needs to be centered over your midfoot. Okay? So we're going to imagine this is this person's torso. The bar, the weight is, the center of the weight is going to be right about here, right? If this is his shoulder up here, the weight's going to be right around there. Weight has to be balanced over his midfoot. The rest of your body is going to put itself in a position to balance with the weight over your midfoot, or you're going to fall forward or back. There's no way around it, okay? This is where femur length comes into play, why people talk about people having short femurs have it a little bit easier when they're trying to squat. And we'll get to that in a second. Okay, so this person's weight is right here, right through this red line. They have this amount of dorsiflexion, so their hips need to be right here in order to balance that weight. Let's contrast that to the person who's wearing squat shoes, okay? Their heel's a little bit elevated, they have the same amount of dorsiflexion, they have the same femur length, but look at where their torso is relative to this center line, okay? This is a straight center line. This person's torso is past the center line. This person's torso is behind it. That means that in order to stay balanced, this person is going to be more upright wearing the squat shoes than with the heeled shoes, okay? Essentially, that means their hips are less further behind the bar. They're closer to the bar than the person using the flat shoes. Normally, you would say that's a good thing. Normally, you want the bar you want your hips as close to the bar as possible because the hips are a primary mover in the squat. And the closer they are to the bar, the easier, the more leverage, better leverage you'll have. Now, that's only true for this particular person with this particular body type. One more thing to keep in mind. There's going to be a balance between the quads and the hips, okay? So based on these leverages, this person is going to be using more hip because this hip's further away. The hips have to do more work, but the quads are close to the bar, so the quads are going to be doing less work. Here, the quads are going to be further ahead of the bar. They're going to be doing more work, okay? So more work for the quads, less for the hips, more for the hips, less for the quads. Here's the thing. Everybody has their own individual strengths and weaknesses outside of what their leverages are. So I think I'm a really good example of this. I have pretty darn strong quads and I have, pretty big quads. You've probably seen them. But, right? But I'm built, I have a better build for deadlifting. And so usually what you would expect is that I'm going to be leaning way far back and using a lot of hip to lift the weight. And honestly, that's what my body naturally wants to do, is to just basically do some type of good morning almost, where my hips are shooting way back behind the bar and I'm using my hips and lower back to lift the weight because I have a shorter torso and longer femurs relatively. But my quads are stronger. And so that's why I end up with this really weird kind of looking squat position where I have a close stance and I'm really pushing my knees forward, but I'm using flat shoes. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because your body, no matter what, it's going to try and put itself in its strongest position. And so, if the strongest position is using my quads, even if I put on heeled shoes, I'm just going to contort myself to basically be in a spot where my quads and my hips are going to balance out to the degree of strength they have. If I'm using heavy weight. If you're using lightweight, well, you can kind of compensate for that. But once you put heavy weight on, your body has to do whatever it can do in order to balance and lift the weight. And so let's take a look at a couple videos of me squatting so you can kind of see the difference that's going on here. Okay, so we're going to compare two heavy squats, one in flats and one in heels. These are pretty ugly squats. because they're basically max effort lifts. And that's what you want to look at when you're trying to evaluate which kind of shoes do you want to use. I think a lot of people, when they try to assess technique, they look at their best lifts, right? The cleanest looking ones with light weight. And that's not going to tell you anything that's useful, right? Because you're really concerned about how much weight you can lift. So let's compare these two. And the left and flats, it's beltless, so that is going to change some things, but it's the best I got. I haven't taken a heavy single in sleeves in a very long time. So again, two very ugly reps, but as you can see, my torso is in a damn similar position in both. It's nearly folded over, right? And while it is a little bit more upright when I'm wearing the heels, it's still very much flat, right? It's very much parallel to the ground. So we're going to take one more look at it, and this time, as we go, I want you to really focus on the angle of my shins relative to the floor and the angle of my torso relative to the floor, and how that torso angle changes throughout the movement, whether I'm using flats or whether I'm using heels. And spoiler alert, what you're going to see is they're nearly identical, because under that heavy weight, my body's just going to do whatever it can to make sure the strongest muscles are being the primary movers, okay? Again, remember the belt, not having the belt on the left is going to make some difference. All right, almost identical starting position. And then as we descend, almost identical form, right? I stay upright a little bit longer, but right here, I'm in the same damn position. Maybe my chest is a little bit higher when I'm wearing the heels, but that's really because of the belt or lack thereof. Now, let's go back to leverages and talk about the difference between torso length and femur length. So right here, we have a person who has a fairly short torso and fairly long femurs. If we change this up, if we give this person a long torso and short femurs, to keep that same balance, they can be more upright. This is why if you have short torso or long torso and short femurs, you're going to have an easier time squatting, because without changing anything else, we've moved your hips close to the bar, and so you have better leverage. Okay? Contrast that with someone who has long ass femurs. This person is going to have a miserable time squatting, because they basically have to be bent over like that. Very, very difficult to stand up straight in that position. So that's why leverages are important. Typically, you will see that people with long torsos and short femurs do even better with heels, because they're naturally able to stay upright. And so even if we put this artificial length on there, they're going to be even more upright, and so they're going to have even better leverages. So the people with the best leverages for squatting are usually going to be the people who wear heels. And a lot of times when people are deciding do they need to wear heels or not, they look at the best squatters. You can see why that's not a good idea. You want to look at somebody who has similar proportions and similar muscular strengths and weaknesses to you if you want to get an idea of that based on someone else. But the whole point of today's video is that you really shouldn't be judging what you're going to do based on somebody else. You really should be looking at these things individually, and you should be looking at your own, assessing yourself independently of anybody else to decide, okay, are squat shoes good for me or not? Hopefully this video has kind of showed you what kind of difference it's going to make, so you have a starting point to make that determination. Now, one more thing that I want to go over, and that is how to determine on your own how to do that analysis, all right? We'll start with dorsiflexion. Do you have sufficient dorsiflexion? This is a very easy test. All you have to do, you can do it naked if you want, wearing no heels at all, get into a squat position. Make sure that you're pushing your knees forward as far as you can and that you're keeping your heels on the ground. If you can go all the way down and you can keep balance over the middle of your foot, not over your toes, then you have sufficient dorsiflexion to squat. Okay? If you find that, yes, I can go down and I can keep my weight on my heels, or I keep my heels on the floor, but I have to shift my weight on my toes, you have an issue with dorsiflexion. If you find that you can go all the way down, no issues, and if you find that, okay, I can go down and I can keep the weight over my heels, but it's not, or I can keep the weight over my midfoot and keep my heel on the floor, but it doesn't feel natural, I feel kind of off balance, well, you might have an issue with balance, or you might just need to work on your movement patterns a little bit more. You might need to get more comfortable in that position. If that's the case, you want to practice active dorsiflexion on all the movements that you have that involve your calves. So that's going to be your squat. You want to think about active dorsal. What I mean by that, you want to think about keeping tightness in your shins. Tightness in your shins and calves as you go down to the bottom of the squat. Great way to practice this is on calf raise. Just do calf raises, keep both your shin, right, the muscles in your shin anterior to the pubis. You want to keep those muscles and the muscles in your calf tight throughout the entire range of motion. You're actively doing the negative, staying tight on the negative. That will make a huge, huge difference in your ability to stay comfortable in the squat. If you can't do it all, you need to do more flexibility stuff. Balance is just practice. Some people are going to have it easier than others. Some people have a natural sense of balance. They're really good at it. Other people don't. If you don't have balance, you got to practice. That's all there is to it. If you really, really suck at balance, you can wear heels for that. And just keep in mind it might change your leverages, and that's a trade-off you're willing to make. But I would prefer that you just practice this more than anything else. It will come with practice. And then leverages. Leverages is the third one, and obviously the hardest one. So to assess this, the best way that I know is to do one heavy session in heels and one heavy session in flats, and to record both of them. And if you look, you will probably look fairly similar in both videos, right? Your heavy rep in flats and heavy rep in heels will probably look very similar. But when you do that rep, you want to look at where your torso is relative to the bar. If it looks like you're leaning way far back, even with the heels on, you probably want flats. You're probably a hip dominant lifter. Okay, and there's no real reason for you to be wearing those heels. This isn't 100% of the time, but more or less, it's a nice rule of thumb. If you find that you have a nice upright torso, regardless of whether you have flats or heels on, probably better with heels, because they're just going to reinforce the fact that, hey, I'm able to stay pretty upright in the squat and be a little bit more quad dominant. Last thing to consider is your goals. And so if your goal is specifically quad development, obviously it makes sense to put a little bit more emphasis on those quads. If you're doing exercises like the front squat or safety bar squat that we mentioned, it might make a little bit more sense to wear heels, because you want to be able to keep that balance pretty easily. If your goal is to develop your posterior chain more, you probably want to use flats. You know, maybe this doesn't apply to your competition lift, but if you really think you need to bring up your hamstrings, bring up your glutes, bring up your hips, then you probably want to do most of that work in flat shoes. Okay? Again, it's a complicated topic, and you know, it doesn't have to take you years and years to figure out whether you need to wear heels or flats, but if you're just making your decision based on, oh, well, you know, so-and-so squats a billion pounds and he wears heels, so I'm going to too, that's a poor choice. Okay? Be really mindful with this stuff. This is important stuff, because it will make a big long-term difference in your training. One more thing, never ever pull in heeled shoes unless you're an Olympic weightlifter. There are better ways of accomplishing the same goal of wearing heels, and you're just going to limit your overall strength and throw your balance off for when you do switch to flats. Okay? Hope this helped. I'll see you next time.